The story began in 2018, when Pakistan released millions of young trout into mountain lakes and rivers. 5 years later, something happened that no one had expected. The mountain rivers of the Hindu Kush, which had been almost fishless for centuries, were transformed into a world-class destination for trout fishing. Villages that had once struggled with unemployment began earning incomes that exceeded those of some nearby towns. But that was only the beginning. As the fish arrived, something else came with them. Even today, locals still debate whether the project was the smartest decision in the country's history or the most expensive mistake ever made. The Pakistani government launched a program that many biologists described as a bold experiment. Millions of juvenile trout were released into lakes and rivers across the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province waters that had never been home to this species before. The project did not involve just dozens or even hundreds of lakes. It covered thousands of mountain water bodies located between 2,000 and 4,000 meters above sea level. Transporting the fish was an enormous challenge. Reaching some lakes required up to 12 hours of hiking, and the fish had to be carried alive throughout the journey. Critics argued that the project made no sense. Pakistan's mountain lakes were nothing like the rivers of Scotland or the fjords of Norway. Their waters were so cold that swimming for more than 5 minutes could cause dangerous hypothermia. Food sources were also extremely limited. Insects were scarce, algae were almost non-existent, and local mountain communities insisted that the trout would never survive. To them, the entire project was simply a waste of money. The government invested around $8 million during the first phase, an amount roughly equal to the province's annual healthcare budget. Opposition members in parliament demanded an explanation for spending millions on fish instead of roads, schools, and hospitals. The government's response surprised everyone. Instead of showing maps of rivers and fish, officials presented a map of poverty. Regions such as Chitral, the Kailash Valley, and the Upper Swat River had average annual household incomes of only $300. Young people were leaving for Karachi and Lahore because there were almost no reliable jobs. Beautiful landscapes and clean mountain air alone could not support families. The idea came from Pakistani biologist Zahid Hamid, who had studied successful trout industries in Norway and New Zealand, where recreational trout fishing generates billions of dollars. In his report, he argued that Pakistan's mountains already possessed everything trout needed: clean water, ideal temperatures, and untouched natural habitats. The only thing missing was the fish. His report eventually reached government officials, and 2 years later, the project officially began. Behind closed doors, some officials jokingly referred to it as Zahid's madness. The first winter proved extremely difficult. Only about 30% of the released trout survived, far below expectations. Some shallow lakes froze completely. Others lacked sufficient oxygen. Entire shipments of fish died during transport after oxygen supplies were exhausted before reaching their destinations. Despite these setbacks, the surviving trout adapted remarkably well. Within 1 year, researchers recorded trout weighing nearly half a kilogram. After 2 years, some exceeded 1 kilogram. This puzzled scientists because the mountain waters appeared almost devoid of food. Further research revealed that fast-flowing mountain streams contained huge numbers of tiny crustaceans and insect larvae, invisible to the naked eye but more than enough to sustain healthy trout populations. The discovery confirmed that Zahid Hamid had been right all along. The mountain waters were, in fact, an ideal habitat. During the program's 3rd year, the first recreational anglers arrived. There were only about 200 visitors throughout the entire fishing season. Most came from Islamabad and Lahore, paying $20 each for a fishing permit before hiking into the mountains with telescopic fishing rods packed in their backpacks. Then came the winter of 2018, a season that nearly destroyed the entire project. In November, temperatures across the mountains of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa plunged to 23 degrees Celsius, about 8 degrees colder than the previous year's average. Heavy snowfall arrived unusually early, burying the region under thick layers of snow. High-altitude lakes froze solid. In many smaller lakes, the ice reached all the way to the bottom, leaving no living organisms alive beneath the surface. What happened next had never appeared in any government plan. Without receiving orders or payment, local residents began trying to save the trout themselves. They simply refused to watch years of hard work disappear. In the village of Torco, several men cut openings through the thick ice and took turns guarding them day and night to prevent them from freezing over again. This unexpected act completely changed the future of the program. Until then, the government had viewed local communities merely as people carrying out instructions. Afterward, they became true partners in the project. The trout program survived its second harsh winter, with losses reduced by half. Losses fell again during the third winter. By the fourth year, winter mortality in the monitored lakes had dropped to just 18%, a survival rate that trout farming experts in Norway consider acceptable, even for long-established commercial farms. While local communities were saving the trout in the mountains, the program was facing another battle in Islamabad. In January 2019, the Parliamentary Committee on Natural Resources requested a report on the project's results. The numbers looked discouraging. The government had spent $8 million. More than half of the released fish had died. Tourist numbers remained very low, and there was still no measurable economic return. Several lawmakers demanded that the program be shut down immediately and called for a formal investigation. One of its strongest critics was Farooq Sattar, a member of parliament from Karachi who had never even visited the mountains of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. During a 20-minute speech, he described the project as a waste of taxpayers' money and demanded that those responsible be held accountable. The government's response did not come in the form of charts or statistics. Instead, officials played an 8-minute video from the village of Torco. It showed local men standing on frozen lakes beside open fires and holes cut through the ice. Exhaustion was visible on their faces after weeks without proper rest, as they worked day and night to save fish they had never believed would survive in the first place. The committee watched the footage in complete silence. The project was not canceled, but its funding was reduced by 1/3. Political criticism was only part of the challenge. A scientific debate also emerged. In 2020, Professor Mohammed Akram of the University of Lahore published a study warning that releasing large numbers of trout into mountain lakes could damage fragile ecosystems. As predators, trout might eliminate aquatic insects, crustaceans, and other invertebrates. Eventually, he argued, the trout themselves would run out of food and begin starving. His research quickly spread through scientific circles. Several international organizations suspended plans to support the program, and the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation postponed partnership negotiations indefinitely. 1 year later, Zahid Hamid's research team responded with its own study covering 24 mountain lakes. The findings were mixed. Professor Akram had been partly correct. In 3 lakes with exceptionally high trout populations, some invertebrate species had indeed declined. However, the remaining lakes told a different story. Researchers discovered that the trout mainly fed on abundant insect larvae already present in the streams. By reducing those dominant species, the trout actually created opportunities for other organisms to thrive. In 7 lakes, biodiversity had increased over 3 years instead of declining. The strongest response to critics came not from laboratories but from reality. In 2021, recreational fishing tourism in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa generated a documented $4 million in revenue. Most of that money stayed within mountain villages. Guest house owners, horse handlers, fishing guides, and women preparing meals for visitors all benefited. Within just 3 years, average household income in participating communities increased by 62%. After those results became public, Farooq Sattar quietly stopped criticizing the project. In 2022, the Norwegian Development Agency resumed negotiations and provided funding to expand trout hatcheries. Ironically, Professor Muhammad Akram, once one of the program's strongest critics, also received research funding to continue long-term environmental monitoring. By 2023, the project was no longer considered breaking news. It had simply transformed the mountains. When journalist Imran Shah visited the Chitral region, he expected to find a few fishermen and some government reports. Instead, he discovered an entirely new local economy that had emerged in only 5 years. In the village of Ayun, there had not been a single guest house in 2018. Now there were 14, and every one of them was fully booked. Most visitors came from outside Pakistan. Fishing tourism began attracting anglers from Europe and the Gulf countries. A week-long fishing trip typically cost between $1,500 and $3,000, still cheaper than a comparable experience in Scotland. One feature made Pakistan's mountains especially attractive: their remarkable solitude. An angler could spend several days beside a lake without seeing another person. As trout became more valuable, illegal fishing declined dramatically. The reason was not increased government patrols. Local residents themselves began protecting the rivers. A live trout in a tourist destination had become far more valuable than one sold in a local market. In the village of Buni, the village council introduced its own fishing regulations without any government intervention. Each angler was allowed to catch only 2 fish per day. Fishing during the breeding season was prohibited. Only hooks designed to minimize injury to released fish were permitted. Fines collected from violators were placed into a community fund. When Zahid Hamid learned about these rules, he described them as the project's greatest achievement. People had begun protecting a natural resource that had not even existed 5 years earlier. Meanwhile, the trout continued growing. In Chandra Lake, average trout weight reached nearly 2 kilograms, sustained entirely by natural food sources. The project also expanded dramatically. It eventually covered more than 1,000 lakes and over 800 kilometers of rivers and streams. Journalist Imran Shah summarized the transformation with a sentence that later became famous: "Pakistan created a paradise for mountain fishing while everyone else was arguing about whether it was even possible." The trout did not remain confined to the stocked lakes. Naturally, they began migrating downstream into lower rivers. They appeared in places that had never been included in the original program. In 2021, fishermen along the Swat River started catching entire schools of trout in waters where the species had never been recorded before. By 2022, trout had spread throughout the entire Chitral River. Research showed that the fish had adapted even to water temperatures as high as 17 degrees Celsius, encouraging Zahid Hamid to consider expanding the program further. However, this success revealed a new problem. The trout began competing with native fish species, especially the mahseer, raising concerns among residents and environmental groups. In response, the ministry established a scientific task force and installed barriers designed to allow water to flow while preventing trout from reaching sensitive habitats. The barriers required continuous maintenance. Meanwhile, success in the upper mountains remained undeniable. The Masdouj River had become one of Asia's premier trout rivers. Local residents mastered the art of fly fishing, a technique previously unknown in the region. By 2023, more than 60 professional local fishing guides were working throughout the area. Tourism also brought another unexpected benefit: internet access. New communication towers were built in remote mountain communities, giving mobile coverage to villages that had never before been connected. Women became some of the project's biggest beneficiaries. Many began preparing meals for tourists from their homes and accepting online reservations before visitors even arrived. In the village of Kalket, a woman named Zara started by cooking for fishing groups. Within 2 years, she had opened her own small guest house. Her monthly income eventually exceeded her husband's. The project's impact extended beyond tourism and fishing. It also helped protect the forests. Residents realized that cutting trees caused soil erosion and muddy water, threatening both the trout and the tourists. As a result, the Council of Torco banned tree cutting around rivers and lakes. Another surprise soon followed. Researchers visiting Chitral to study birds found that fish-eating species had become much more abundant. The osprey returned to nest in the region after an absence of 30 years. The news spread quickly. Bird watchers from Europe began visiting alongside anglers and mountain hikers. Nature, however, was not finished testing the project. During the summer of 2023, the monsoon season arrived unusually early. Rainfall reached nearly twice the normal level. Rivers overflowed, roads were washed away, and several villages became isolated. Army helicopters were required to rescue groups of stranded tourists. Even so, the trout proved far more resilient than scientists had expected. Post-flood surveys showed that trout populations had not declined. In some lakes, they had actually increased because floodwaters carried large amounts of organic material that boosted food supplies. In the rivers, trout populations that had lived separately for years mixed together for the first time, raising new scientific questions about their future genetics. The floods also exposed another weakness. Many guest houses had been built too close to the rivers. 18 buildings were damaged. Rather than rebuilding in the same locations, residents relocated to higher, safer ground, applying lessons learned from the disaster. By 2024, revenue from recreational fishing and ecotourism had nearly matched the total cost of the entire project. Average household income remained 62% higher than before the program began. Perhaps most importantly, the long-standing migration of young people to the cities slowed significantly. For the first time in decades, the Chitral region recorded a net increase in its population. Even so, the project was far from perfect. Mistakes had been made in selecting some of the lakes, and concerns about the trout's impact on native fish species remained unresolved, requiring continuous scientific monitoring. Yet, the project's greatest achievement was not simply introducing a new fish. It inspired local communities to protect their own natural resources. Forests expanded, local economies flourished, and conservation gradually became self-sustaining without constant government intervention. When Zahid Hamid was asked whether the project had been a brilliant decision or an expensive mistake, his answer reflected both sides of the story. He said it had been both. Real mistakes had certainly been made. Some predictions had proved wrong. Some lakes had failed. New environmental challenges had emerged. But the final outcome demonstrated something far more important. When people truly believe in a resource, take ownership of it, and work together to protect it, that single resource can transform an entire region